The axe came down so hard it split the wooden table clean in half. I remember the sound, that crack, like a gunshot inside a small room. And my brother Elias, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, chest heaving, sweat pouring down the side of his face, both hands still gripping that axe handle like if he let go, the whole world would fall apart. "We're not going back," he said. His voice was low, controlled. The kind of controlled that's actually terrifying because you know there's something wild sitting just underneath it. "We are never going back." And me? I just stood there in the doorway of that filthy boarding house room in San Francisco, staring at the two halves of a table that used to belong to a man who just cheated us out of everything we had. Every cent, every plan, every single thing we'd crossed an ocean for, gone. And that was the night that changed both of our lives forever. That was the night my brother Elias decided we were going to go live inside a tree. And I know how that sounds. I know. But to understand why two grown men, two brothers who had survived things that would break most people, ended up hollowing out a home inside the belly of one of the largest living things on Earth, I need to take you back to where it all started. So before I go any further, if you enjoy stories like this, real stories, the kind that feel too strange to be true but hit you somewhere deep because you know they are, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I genuinely read every single one, and if you know someone who loves history, survival, or just a good story about two stubborn men doing the impossible, share this with them. All right, let's go back. It was 1892. My name is William Cobb, and my brother Elias was 4 years older than me and about 4 times more stubborn than any human being had a right to be. We'd come over from Missouri, before that Germany if you go back far enough, chasing the same dream that had swallowed up half of America's desperate men at the time. California. Gold. A fresh start. The whole shining promise of the West. We weren't naive. Not entirely. We'd heard the stories. We knew the gold rush was already long over by the time we arrived, but Elias had this way of making you believe that the timing didn't matter. That we were different. That the land still had something to give us, and if we were just willing to work harder than the next man. And for a while it felt like he was right. We found work in the lumber trade up in Calaveras County, cutting timber for a man named Aldrich who paid poorly but paid consistently, which was more than most men in our position could say. The work was brutal. I'm not going to dress it up. We were up before the sun and we didn't stop until our arms stopped working. But Elias loved it. He loved the trees. That surprised me because Elias wasn't a man who loved much of anything quietly. He was loud about everything. But when he stood among those big trees in the morning light, he'd go quiet in a way I'd never seen from him anywhere else. One evening after a long shift, he stopped walking ahead of me on the trail back to camp and just stood there looking up. I almost walked into him. Will," he said, not looking down. "Do you know how old this one is?" I looked up. It was a sequoia, a big one. Not the biggest I'd seen out there, but big enough that you had to tilt your head all the way back to find where it ended. The bark was this deep, burnt red color, thick and furrowed like the skin of something ancient and unbothered. "Old," I said. He let out this slow breath. 2,000 years, the foreman said, maybe more. It was already old when the Romans were building their roads. He finally looked at me. "And they want us to cut it down to make shingles." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? That was the job. That was the world. But something shifted in Elias that evening. I didn't catch it right away. I should have. And that was the first sign that my brother was starting to think about something much bigger than a paycheck. Now here's where things take a turn I still don't fully understand, even looking back. A few months into the work with Aldrich, Elias started disappearing on his days off. Just gone. Wouldn't say where. I'd ask and he'd shrug it off. Walking, he'd say, clearing my head. Elias didn't clear his head. Elias didn't even really have a head to clear. No, he was all forward motion, all what's next. So the disappearing bothered me more than I let on. Then one Sunday afternoon, he came back to the bunkhouse with his boots caked in mud up to the ankle and his eyes bright in that specific way they got when he'd figured something out. He sat down across from me, leaned his forearms on his knees and said, I found something. What kind of something? I asked. He smiled, slow. The kind you have to see. He wouldn't say another word about it. Not that night. Not the next morning. He just let it sit there between us like a stone in a river, and I kept stepping around it and it kept being there. 2 weeks later, everything with Aldrich collapsed. It was a business deal gone rotten. Elias had put our combined savings into a timber contract with a middleman in San Francisco. A slick man named Horace Devlin who had a good handshake and a face you trusted immediately, which should have been our first warning. Devlin disappeared with every cent we'd given him. Just gone. No forwarding address, nothing. That's what brought us to that boarding house room. That's what brought Elias's axe down through the table. And when the echo of that crack finally died away and he looked at me with those wild, steady eyes, he said it again. I found something, Will. In the hills. And I think we can live there. I stared at him. Live where, Elias? He set the axe down, wiped his hands on his trousers. And he said the words I've never forgotten. Inside the tree. I want to be honest with you. My first reaction was not wonder. It was not curiosity. It was not the adventurous thrill of a man ready to embrace the frontier spirit. My first reaction was that my brother had finally completely lost his mind. But here's the thing about Elias. And this is the part that kept me following him my whole life, even when every sensible part of me said don't. He had this patience when he was serious. This calm. He wasn't raving, he wasn't desperate. And he sat down in the wreckage of that room, surrounded by the broken pieces of a table, and he started to explain. And the more he talked, the more my arguments started to quietly fall apart. Because what Elias had found out there in those hills wasn't just a big tree. It was something else entirely. Something that would take both of us more than a year to understand, and the rest of our lives to carry. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night I agreed to go see it, just to see. Just to stop him from looking at me like that. And that was the last decision I ever made as a man who lived a normal life. Because once you see something that size, once you stand at the base of it and feel how small you truly are, something happens to you that you can't undo. We left San Francisco the very next morning, and I remember thinking, as the city disappeared behind us, that we were probably making the worst mistake of our lives. I had no idea we were actually walking toward the most extraordinary thing either of us would ever do. What Elias had found in those hills. I still get a feeling in my chest when I think about seeing it for the first time, and what we discovered when we got up close. There was something inside that tree that neither of us expected. Something that changed the plan entirely. That's where we're going next. I heard it before I saw it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being close to something truly massive. It has a sound, not a loud one, no, almost the opposite. It's this deep, pressing silence that isn't really silence at all. It's more like the world holding its breath, like everything around it. The birds, the wind, even the dirt under your boots, understands that it's in the presence of something older than itself and decides to behave accordingly. Elias was ahead of me on the trail, moving fast the way he always did when he was excited, which meant I was half jogging just to keep up. My pack was heavy, my boots were still damp from the creek crossing we'd done an hour back, and I was tired in that deep, bone-level way you get after sleeping badly in a wagon for 2 days straight. "Elias," I called out. "Elias, slow down. I'm not a horse." He didn't slow down. He turned around and walked backwards for a few steps, grinning at me like he was 12 years old, and then pointed up ahead through the tree line and said, "There," and I stopped walking. Because there it was, I don't have the words. I want to be honest with you about that right now. I've been thinking about how to describe this moment for longer than I can tell you, and I still don't have the right words, so I'll just tell you what happened in my body. My chest got tight. My mouth went dry. And for a long moment I forgot completely that I was a grown man with debts and a ruined coat and blisters on both heels. I forgot all of it. Because standing at the base of that tree, looking up, was like standing at the base of a cathedral that God built before he decided what religion was. The Sequoia was enormous. Not the way a tall building is enormous, where you understand its size because you can count the floors or measure it against something you know. This was enormous in a way that broke your measuring. The trunk was so wide that Elias and I, standing at opposite sides, couldn't even see each other. The bark rose up in these great red-brown columns, thick as a man's body, furrowed deep like ancient muscle. And it went up, and up, and up, until the canopy disappeared into the morning fog and you just had to trust that it ended somewhere. "How wide?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. 30 feet, maybe more," Elias said. He was watching my face. That was always his favorite part, watching people see things for the first time. 30 feet, I repeated. I couldn't make the number feel real. "Come around to the other side," he said. And something in his voice shifted, got serious. "Come see what I found. I want you to understand something before I tell you what was on the other side of that tree. Yeah, because this next part, this is the part that moved us from two broke men staring at a big tree to two broke men making the most insane decision of our lives." On the eastern face of the trunk, maybe 8 feet up from the roots, there was a scar. A massive one. The kind left behind by a fire that had burned itself out inside the tree, maybe decades ago, maybe longer. The sequoia had survived it, the way sequoias survive most things, with that impossibly thick bark that laughs at fire. But the scar had left something behind. A hollow. Not a small one. Not a little notch where a squirrel might nest. A hollow you could walk into. A hollow that, when Elias held up the lantern and we both leaned forward and looked, went back further than the light could reach. "How far does it go?" I asked. "Far enough," he said. I looked at him. "Into far enough for what?" And he looked at me with those steady eyes, that calm he got when he'd already decided something. And he said, "Far enough for a floor, a door, a stove maybe if we're smart about it. Far enough for 2 men to live." The silence after that was the loudest silence I've ever stood inside. Now I said no. I want you to know that. I said no clearly, and I said it more than once. I told him it was dangerous. I told him the tree could shift, could fall, could finish what that old fire had started. I told him we'd freeze in the winter and roast in the summer, and that a man couldn't live inside a tree like some kind of... I used the word squirrel, I'm almost sure of it. I said we'd be laughed out of the county. Elias listened to all of it. He nodded along, and then he said very quietly, "Chew, you got a better idea." And that was the problem. I didn't. We had no money, no employer, no shelter, and winter was coming in a way you could already feel at the edges of the morning air. The towns nearby weren't interested in 2 more broke men with nothing to offer. And Elias had already been thinking about this for weeks. He hadn't come to me without a plan. He'd come to me with a blueprint already drawn in that stubborn head of his. 1 month, he said. "Give me 1 month. If it doesn't work, we walk away." "And go where?" I said. He smiled. "Exactly. That was not the most reassuring conversation I've ever had, but I shook his hand. Because what else do you do when your brother is standing at the mouth of a hollow tree in the California hills, looking at you like the whole thing is already decided? You shake his hand, and you start figuring out how to build a door. The first week was brutal in a way I hadn't anticipated, and I say that as a man who'd already been through some genuinely brutal things. The inside of the hollow was not what you'd call move-in ready. There was decades of rot at the base, old ash and char layered into the wood, nests from animals I couldn't identify and didn't want to, and a dampness that got into your lungs and sat there. We spent the first 3 days just clearing it out. Digging, scraping, hauling debris. The smell alone was enough to make your eyes water. But here's the thing, and this is the part I didn't expect. As we cleared it, it got bigger. Not physically. I don't mean the tree was changing, I mean our understanding of it was changing. Every layer we pulled back revealed more space than we'd seen before, and the hollow wasn't just a burned-out pocket. It went deeper, curved slightly, opened up on one side where the fire had eaten furthest into the heartwood. By the end of day 3, we were standing inside a space that was, I measured it with my arm span, roughly 12 feet across at its widest and nearly 9 feet tall at the center. I stood there in the dim light of the lantern looking around at the curved red-black walls of living wood, and I felt something I was not prepared to feel. I felt like I was inside something that was breathing. "Elias," I said, not sure why I was keeping my voice low. "Does it feel like it's—" "Yes," he said. He was running his hand along the inner wall, slow, like he was feeling for a pulse. "I noticed it the first time I came in. It's not your imagination." And he was right. Sequoias move with temperature and moisture. The wood shifts, expands, contracts. When you're inside the belly of one, you feel it, subtle, like being held by something that isn't quite still. Some nights, lying on the ground before we'd built the platform floor, I'd wake up in the dark and hear it. Just the faintest deep tick and settle of the wood around me. And my heart would slam for a second before I remembered where I was. Before I remembered that I was sleeping inside a living giant, and it was still, impossibly, alive. We built the floor out of boards Elias had quietly negotiated from a nearby mill. I never asked how, and he never told me, and I decided that was for the best. We notched them into the lower curve of the trunk walls so they didn't need legs, and we built a door frame out of salvaged timber and hung an actual door on iron hinges that Elias found at an abandoned mining claim 3 miles east. We cut a low vent hole near the top for a small iron stovepipe that we ran up through a gap where the hollow met open air. It took us the better part of 3 weeks. 3 weeks of aching backs and cut hands and arguments. Real arguments, the kind only brothers can have, where you're both too proud to say the other one is right even when you know it. There was one night where we genuinely didn't speak for 6 hours. Over a floorboard, I don't even remember which one of us was right, but by the end of the 3rd week we had something. Not much. Not something you'd call comfortable, but something you'd call shelter. Something real. And the night we finally got the stove lit inside that hollow, and the warmth started to fill up that curved wood space, and Elias and I sat there on the floor with our backs against the inner wall of a 2,000-year-old tree, eating salt pork and hard biscuits out of a single pan. That was the first time since San Francisco that I felt something close to okay. But I want to tell you what happened the next morning, because that's when everything got complicated. I woke up before Elias, which almost never happened. He was always the early one. And I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold gray light of a California morning in the hills. And standing about 30 feet from our tree, perfectly still, was a man. He was watching the door. He was watching me. He was old, dark coat, hat pulled low. and he had an expression on his face that I couldn't read, not anger, not surprise. Is something more like recognition, like he'd been expecting to find someone here, like he'd been here before. I turned to call for Elias. When I turned back, the man was gone. I told Elias about the man at breakfast. He went quiet in a way that scared me. Not the calm quiet, not the thinking quiet. The other kind. The kind that meant he already knew something he hadn't told me yet. And what he said next, what he admitted he'd found the very first time he came to that tree alone, that changed everything about what we thought we were building. Because we weren't the first ones to try to live inside that tree. Not even close. Elias didn't answer me right away. That was how I knew it was serious, because Elias always had an answer. For everything. Wrong or right, fast or slow, that man always had something to say. Yet it was practically a personality defect. So when I told him about the man in the gray morning light, and Elias just sat there with his spoon halfway to his mouth and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that wasn't inside that hollow, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elias, I heard you, he said. Then say something. He set the spoon down, looked at me, and then he reached into his coat, the one he'd hung on the iron nail we'd driven into the door frame, and pulled out something I hadn't seen before. A small, flat piece of wood, roughly cut, maybe 6 inches long, and carved into it deep and deliberate were letters. He held it out to me across the pan of cooling salt pork. I took it, turned it toward the light from the stove vent. It said, J. Thorne, 1879. I stared at it for longer than made sense. And my brain kept trying to arrange the information into something that didn't mean what I thought it meant. Where did you find this? I asked. First time I came inside, Elias said. It was pressed into a crack in the back wall, far side near the floor. I almost missed it. He paused. I didn't tell you because I thought maybe it was old. Someone passing through, carving their name like people do. People don't carve their name in a year unless they stayed somewhere, I said. He nodded slowly. I know that now. I turned the piece of wood over in my hands. The carving was clean, not desperate, not rushed. Someone had taken their time with this, someone who'd had time to take. 1879, I said. Or that's 13 years ago. Yes. And you didn't think to mention it before we built a floor in this man's house? Elias had the good grace to look uncomfortable. I didn't think it was his house. Elias, I know, he said. I know. We searched the hollow properly that morning. Not the casual clearing out we'd done in the first week, pulling debris and rot and animal nests. This was different. This was slow, deliberate, on our knees, running our hands along the base of the walls, pressing into every crack and crevice with fingers and lamplight. And what we found. I want you to sit with this for a second because it still does something to my chest when I think about it. What we found was that J. Thorne had been thorough. There were 2 more carved pieces of wood. E1 was just initials and what looked like a date that had partially rotted away. We could make out 1880, maybe 1881. The other was longer. A full sentence carved small and precise into a flat piece of bark that had been wedged under a root curve near the back wall, which is why we'd missed it the first time. Elias read it out loud, holding the lamp close. The tree holds better than any man-made thing. I have been warm here when the mountain was not warm. I do not expect to be believed. The 2 of us crouched there in the belly of that sequoia, in the yellow lamplight, reading a dead man's private thought, and neither of us said a single word for a long time. Now here is where I have to tell you something that I've gone back and forth on for years. Whether to include it, how to say it, whether it makes me sound like a man who's lost his grip on sensible thinking. But you came this far with me, so I'm going to tell you the truth. After we found those carvings, something shifted between Elias and me. Not badly, not a fight, nothing broken, more like a realization settling into both of us at the same time, separately, the way realizations sometimes do. We'd come to this tree thinking we were doing something unprecedented, something wild and strange and ours. And now we were holding evidence that someone had been here before us, had thought the same things, had felt that same pull toward the hollow and the warmth and the living walls. And instead of making me feel less special about it, I know that sounds strange. It made me feel something closer to belonging, like the tree had been waiting, not for us specifically, it just waiting. Patient the way a 2,000-year-old thing can afford to be patient, collecting its people one by one across the decades. I told Elias that, quietly, half embarrassed by it. He looked at me for a second, then he said, I was thinking the same thing. I didn't want to say it first because I thought you'd call me soft. I was going to call you soft, I admitted. He laughed. It filled up the hollow and bounced off the curved walls and came back to us warmer than it left. That was a thing about that space. Sound behaved differently inside it. More generous somehow. We started asking around about J. Thorne. Carefully. Small towns in the California hills in the 1890s were not places where strangers asking questions about other strangers got warm receptions. But Elias had a way with people. He could make himself seem less threatening than he was, which was a skill I'd always admired and slightly distrusted. And over the course of several weeks of careful conversation in general stores and at mill sites, and once at a church service we attended purely for social intelligence, we assembled something like a picture. James Thorne, originally from Oregon, came down into Calaveras County around 1878 or 1879, alone, following work that apparently didn't materialize. Word was he'd had a falling out with a business partner. Sound familiar? And found himself broke and without prospects in unfamiliar country. He disappeared from local memory around 1882 or so. Nobody knew where he'd gone. Nobody seemed to have looked very hard. One old man at a trading post, his name was Garrett, leather-faced, who chewed tobacco constantly, seemed to know everything about everyone without ever appearing to pay attention. He squinted at us when Elias mentioned Thorne's name and said, "Heard he found somewhere to hole up in the big trees. People thought he'd gone crazy." "Did they think that before or after he went to the big trees?" Elias asked. Garrett considered this with genuine seriousness. "Probably before," he said. "But after too." I asked if anyone had ever gone looking for him. Garrett shrugged. "Man wants to live in the hills alone, that's his business. Man disappears from the hills alone, that's also his business." He spat into the dirt. "That's California." It was another 2 weeks before we saw the old man again. The one from the morning. The one who'd been standing 30 feet from our door in the gray light, watching. And this time it was Elias who saw him first, and this time he didn't disappear. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards out, and Elias walked toward him slowly, hands visible, the way you approach a deer or an argument you don't want to spook. I followed a few steps behind. Up close, the man was older than I'd first thought. Mid-70s, maybe. His coat was good quality once, long ago. He had a face that had been weathered past the point of reading. You couldn't tell if he was suspicious or frightened or simply tired. His eyes, though. His eyes were sharp, clear. The eyes of a man who'd been alone for a long time and had therefore paid very close attention to everything. Elias stopped about 10 feet away. "We found your name," he said. No preamble, no pleasantries. That was Elias, and the old man looked at him for a long moment, Then he said, voice low and roughened by years of disuse, "You built a proper floor." "We did," Elias said. "I never got around to that." A pause. Something moved across his face that might have been regret. Always meant to. I realized, standing there in the cold mountain air, that I was looking at James Thorne, that this man before us had lived inside our tree, inside his tree, more than a decade before we'd ever found it, that he'd come back, that he still came back, that whatever the tree had done to us in these past months, the holding and the warmth and the sound of breathing wood in the dark, it had done to him first. And it had never fully let him go. We invited him inside. Of course we did. He ducked through the doorframe. It was low, and we'd both cracked our heads on it more times than I want to admit. And he stood in the center of the hollow and looked around at what we'd made of it. The floor, the stove, the 2 rope beds we'd finally built against the far wall. The shelves Elias had notched into the wood on the right side. The lamp hanging from an iron hook in the ceiling. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he crouched down near the back wall, right at the spot where we'd found the longest carving, pressed his fingers to the wood like he was reading something in Braille, and said very quietly, "You found it." "We found it," I said. He nodded, stood back up, and then he did something I truly did not expect. He laughed, not a short laugh, not a polite one, a real one, full and warm and slightly unhinged, and the laugh of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to be funny again. "I wrote that thinking nobody would ever read it," he said when he'd gathered himself. I thought I was just talking to the tree." "What did the tree say back?" Elias asked. Thorne looked at him seriously. "It said, 'Come back.'" He glanced around the hollow once more, at the warmth, at the stove, at the floor he'd never gotten around to building. "I always did." James Thorne stayed for 3 days. He slept on the floor, insisted on it, wouldn't hear of taking either of our beds. And in the evenings by the stove, he told us things. About living in the hollow those first years. About the techniques he'd figured out for managing cold, for keeping the rot back, for reading the tree's moods by the sounds it made at night. About the things he'd gotten wrong that had nearly cost him. And about why he'd left, which was not the story I expected. He'd left, he told us, because a man came from the lumber company. Not threatening, not violent, just a man with papers walking the land, making assessments. Thorne had watched from a distance, had seen the man write something in a ledger, look up at the tree and write something else. And Thorne had understood, in the way you understand things that you can't afford to think about directly, that the tree was on land somebody owned, that it was a resource, that the reason it hadn't been cut yet was not because it was protected, but because the logistics hadn't aligned. Yet. He'd left because he couldn't bear to still be inside when they came for it. The hollow went very quiet after he said that. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the Sequoia's upper canopy, and you could feel the faintest answer in the walls. Elias looked at me. I looked at Elias. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. Because the thinking was too big for the moment, and the moment was too fragile for the thinking. Thorne left on the morning of the 4th day the way he'd appeared, quietly, without ceremony. He shook our hands at the door and looked at both of us and said, "Don't let them take it without a fight." Then he walked into the tree line and was gone. And I never saw James Thorne again. I've wondered ever since whether he was real or whether the tree made him up, whether the hollow had offered us a warning dressed up as an old man, whether J. Thorne, carved careful into a piece of wood in 1879, one was the tree's way of saying, "I have been here longer than your plans, and I will be here after them." Or maybe he was just a man. Just an old man who'd once found the same warmth we found, and wanted to make sure someone was keeping the fire going. What I know is this. What Elias and I built inside that tree was not a stunt, not a story, not something we did because we had no other choice, though we didn't. It was something else. Something that I still carry and can't put a simple name to. We lived inside that Sequoia for 4 seasons. We weathered one of the hardest winters Calaveras County had seen in a decade inside those red-brown walls, with the stove going and the wood breathing around us and the wind throwing itself against bark so thick it barely registered. And we ate meals and argued and laughed and occasionally went whole days without speaking. We carved our own names into a piece of wood, William and Elias Cobb, 1893 on, and pressed it into the same crack where Thorne had left his. And the lumber company man, he came, just as Thorne said he would. But what happened when he came, what Elias said to him, what we did to keep that tree standing, that is a story I'll carry in my chest until the day I don't. What I'll tell you now is that the tree is still standing, as far as I know. I have to believe that. I need to believe that something that old, something that patient, something that collected broken men inside its belly and kept them warm through the winters they couldn't survive alone. I need to believe it's still out there, still breathing, still waiting. Don't they all deserve that? And the things that held us when nothing else would? And that's the story of William and Elias Cobb, the forgotten pioneers who built a life inside the heart of a California giant. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it. Some stories deserve to stop being forgotten. This is one of them. This is one.